In this documentary, we will present both sides of Quebec separatism. We will delve into the history of Quebec and explore how they were conquered and oppressed, whether they are still oppressed after World War II, whether the desire for separatism is justified, the arguments for and against separatism, and what potential resolutions may exist. Before Quebec joined Canada, it used to be known as New France. The majority of its populations were people from France, and it had been under French rule for more than 150 years. This led to the people in the future province of Quebec to have separate ideals, religion, language, and culture from the Britain half. This all was challenged in the British conquest in 1760 and the following Royal Proclamation of 1763 implemented policies that aimed to assimilate the French people. It did this by making it so that the governor was the authority of Quebec, and he had been appointed by the British government and followed their directives. Essentially, remove representation of Quebec quas in the government. English law replaced French law, which was expected as Canada was under Britain. But the problem was that many Quebecois were Catholic. In order to swear the oath of allegiances to work any government jobs, you couldn't be Catholic. The British taking their land and attempting to destroy their culture and religion led to people such as Christie arguing that the conquest was colonialism. Christine once said, post-conquest Quebec can usefully be seen as a colonial site on the same continent as Bengal and Trinidad. It is important to note that Quebec wasn't mistreated as much as Christie described. We'll discuss it later. The government was essentially ruled by the lieutenant governor and an oligarchy composed mostly of English speakers that controlled the legislative and executive councils. Combined with the colony's linguistic and religious division, led to the 1837 rebellion for more rights. The Quebecois, for this time, were suppressed with acts such as the Lawless Aggression Act, martial law, and etc. Such an act allowed civilians to be tried in martial courts. Martial courts tended to have juries filled with officers who were likely sympathetic to the British. This restricted people from having defense counsels or people who defended you in court, and etc. This all led to unfair trials, which could have resulted in many innocent Quebecois to get trial and convicted. In total, there were executions of 32 men, the exile of 144, and conviction of 248 men. There was censorship of media with L'Avenir, Vindicator, and The Constitution all shut down. They were all newspaper, though it's worth noting that Upper Canada had a rebellion as well, and that censorship of media was somewhat normal in Britain. But it doesn't excuse the oppression. The Act of Union did remove the oligarchy and the governor having all the power, but it didn't stop the oppression. East Canada, which is now Quebec, and West Canada, which is now Ontario, had an equal share of votes in Parliament. But the problem was that East Canada had a larger population and was therefore underrepresented in the Parliament. Furthermore, the French language was banned within Parliament. This may not seem significant, as it didn't outright ban it from being spoken, but it does mirror what happened to Ireland. In Ireland, the Britain began by banning language in Parliament. Then they went to areas under British rule. Then they went to courts. And nowadays, only 2% of daily speech and 40% Irish can speak their own language after independence. So far, we have been dealing with oppression of Quebecois representation, language, culture, and religion. But now we'll deal with Quebec's economy. Quebec's economy used to be feudal, just like France during the early 17th century. When the British came, they removed many of these feudal lords, which was good, but they replaced them with British merchants and officers, which wasn't good as the wealth they were getting was from the Quebecois. Worst of all, feudalism was still a thing until various acts from 1822 to 1940 ended it. Feudalism heavily impeded the expansion of capitalism, as the French feudalism had bandelet that made it so the peasant had to pay the lord to use his facilities, since that were perpetual dues, rents that was just rents, which the peasant had to pay, and curvi, that is unpaid labor days. This stopped free wage labor commodity circulation, or people offering their labor in the market. Capitalism relies on workers to sell their labor for wages to a capitalist, and those workers make commodities to the capitalists to sell on the market that are then bought by other workers. The church also attempted to keep Quebec in a feudalistic system because they wanted tithes, cheap farm labor, and religious homogeny. This is also why later on Quebec separated from church and state. Quebec had a problem where the land ownership was being concentrated and the church's vast holding and the increasing population led to stagnated economy, producing a big problem. Usually when a state industrializes, it's a good thing, but in Quebec's case, it was a bad thing, as the sudden growth of its population led to workers, but the problem was that they were ignorant, unschooled, and under the church's influence, because it led to a monopoly capitalism. In 1937, the industrial capital of Quebec was owned by 44% of English Canadians, 34% USA, and 19.8% by French Canadians. This was bad, as the wealth of Quebec wasn't even going to the French majority. The Quiet Revolution was one of the most important things to happen to Quebecois after World War II, as it brought change to their oppression. It was mainly fueled by the pent-up anger under Marquis Duplessis and his Union National Party. His administration kept the Catholic Church's big businesses that were generally under English Canadians and the rural elites in mind instead of the everyday Quebecois. His time stopped modernization, kept Quebec's industry behind, and left French Canadians marginalized in their own province, mainly in the business sector that was filled with English elites. The Quiet Revolution changed this and removed the Catholic Church from controlling healthcare, education, and its influence over the state completely. It led to a much better and more standardized education system that helped it develop. It also implemented an economic incentives to improve the French Canadian majority that were historically exploited. Lastly, it led to more nationalism for Quebec's culture, language, and values. This nationalism led the way to parties advocating for separatism, such as Parti Québécois. There was a widespread and growing sentiment that if Quebec wanted to be free, safe, and not oppressed, they had to gain independence. Both referendums were about sovereignty and were under the Parti Québécois. The first one was in 1980, and about 60% of Quebecois said no to the referendum. The second was under 1995, and 50.58% said no to referendum. Nowadays, Quebec's biggest threat to its language and culture is the rampant immigration and it becoming a minority. You see, Canada has been bringing in a lot of immigrants, likely to reach its population goal. Technically, not a goal that many Canadians have, as many Canadians have different views and goals. But it's instead the goal of the government because of a charity group that lobbies the government called Century Initiatives that want Canada to have 100 million Canadians by 2100. Canada reaching that without immigrating people is unlikely. And Canada is immigrating so many people that 44% of the Canadian population is first or second generation immigrants. This by itself isn't bad, but the problem is that large-scale immigration may dilute Canadian culture, values, and both official languages, including French. The other problem is that Quebec is getting a lower population share or a lower ratio compared to the rest of the Canadian population. In fact, in 1971, it had a population share of 27.9. In 2020, it had a population of 22.6% when compared to the rest of Canada. And it's predicted it will be 20.4% in 2043. This will cause Quebec to be underrepresented, and without immigrating more people or hoping people have more kids, the only solution is Quebec getting more votes. Though giving Quebec more votes will be actually unfair to the rest of Canada, as it will be underrepresenting them and oppressing them. The Quebecois do have the right to preserve their culture and religion as long as they don't harm anyone else. Though, in my biased opinion, Quebecois don't need to push for separatism anymore, as it is clear that they aren't nearly as oppressed or oppressed at all, and the rest of Canada has been accommodating them so that they don't leave. So in my opinion, they have no reason to leave and lose out on their economy. That's just my argument for them not taking succession. But there are some reasons why or why not they should succeed from Canada. Anti-separatist individuals argue that separatism have no understanding of the value of being part of a federal system that treats provinces as equals and has gone out of its way to fulfill the autonomy and recognition of the distinct French language and culture that Quebec requested. Furthermore, when Quebec joined the Confederation in 1867, it was legally bounded to the political system and did not have the right to leave. Even if they were to leave, it would only harm Quebec as it lacks a strong industrial base, and secession would simply hurt its economy. Secession would hurt also other Canadians because Canada stretches from the Pacific to the Atlantic, as Quebec's departure will result in Canada being divided and could further cause political fractures. And essentially, leaving Canada would be a bad idea because Quebec and the rest of Canada share a good relationship. They must commit to stay due to them joining the Confederation in 1867, and leaving would cause suffering to both sides, economies, and political system. Succession arguments by separatist people argue that Quebec is too different from the rest of the provinces. Quebec speaks French, unlike the rest of Canada, who speak English. Furthermore, Quebec's history, religion, tradition differ from those of the rest of Canada. Other separatists remember Quebec's surrender to the British rule, claiming that they will no longer stand by and be dominated by the English colonizers. Only by succeeding can they gain their freedom and future back from the colonizers. Other separatists feared that their them becoming a minority when compared to the rest of the English speaking provinces can lead to their civil rights being violated regularly. There are many ways this can end. The future to simply stop wanting separatism is a very plausible reality without the Canadian government needing to add more policies designed to accommodate separatists. Essentially, young people are less worried about national values such as language, culture, and etc. when compared to the old people, who were the same people who could vote during the referendum and the Quiet Revolution. And young people trust the federal government more. 55% of people living in Quebec under the age of 40 are consider the French language being threatened, which is lower than the 75% of people who are above the age of 55 who are concerned of it being threatened. This may be due to the fact that the Quiet Revolution was so influential and big that Canadian government was essentially forced to accommodate the separatists to make sure Quebec didn't leave. Though implementing policies to protect Quebec's language and culture and give more autonomy may perhaps be the better move to keep Quebec. The reason is that the only reason why the sentiment is shrinking is that Quebec is in a time where they are satisfied enough with the federal government to not want to leave Canada. Canada should aim to make Quebec's and the rest of Canada's relations so good that Quebec wouldn't wish to leave. They can implement policies that either require or heavily encourage people to pursue French earlier on and to have it as one of their courses in grade 12, because it removes Quebec's tension that the French language is at risk and possibly bring them closer and more united. Now, it can also end with Quebec succeeding. There have been many Quebecois who tossed the idea of joining America. This will likely not happen. First, there is no guarantee that America will have great policies to meet its demands. Second, recent events in America with the tariffs and threats to annex Canada have actually ended up decreasing the amount of dissatisfaction within the Canadian government and increased pride in being Canadian by 30% within Quebec. The only exception is Manitoba. This is likely due to the tariffs hurting the economies and industries such as timber, mining, and etc. in Quebec. And by uniting, they can get together to retaliate against their common enemy. Joining America willingly for Quebec is very unlikely. Separating fully from Canada and becoming a new nation is the most likely thing to happen after secession, as that's what most separatists are arguing, and unlike joining America, it isn't heavily hated. The only thing keeping this and other secessions from happening is a referendum. You see, this was already a very possible reality twice in Quebec, 1980 and 1995. In 1995, it nearly won, but was short of less than 1% of votes. If a referendum were to go through, Quebec would non-violently gain its freedom and become an independent nation that would have its own rules and regulations.